What's up, everyone? Welcome back to yet again another episode of the Accelerate Your Life podcast. As always, I'm your host, Mallory Marks, and we are going to dive into a fast fit facts episode today. So, an FFF, if you are new here, this is a little category, if you will, of episodes that I like to do now and then that basically is just trying to take a point within fitness, nutrition, health, whatever, and do a really quick. I air quotes really quick because with me I can get a little long-winded, but try to make it as quick and efficient as I can with really just giving you the facts fast and like cutting out the bullshit, right? Because I think that there is so much out there when it comes to health, fitness, nutrition, all of that it contradicts. It is a lot of BS stuff. It can get very overwhelming. Even all the stuff that's out there that's correct can get really overwhelming, and it can seemingly contradict itself. Because the thing is, the hard part with any of this is it always depends. The answer to really any question in fitness is it depends. But there are some things that we can really like hone in on and at least have the basics of the actual facts and science with. And that's the purpose of these episodes, is to give you it, no bullshit, make it easy to understand, easy to digest, and easy to take and implement into your current health, fitness, nutrition, whatever. So today is going to be all about progressive overload. So this is going to be in regards to your training, your exercise, and hopefully you can walk away from this episode with some thoughts on how to incorporate progressive overload and hopefully begin to see some really big improvements and changes and progress due to progressive overload. So first off, well, I think we need to start with what it is. And actually, let me give you a little bit of a rundown of what we are going to cover in this episode when it comes to progressive overload. Obviously, we are going to start off with what is it. Some of you guys may be familiar, and if you already are, I still would encourage you to listen to this episode, because even if you know what it is, you may not know all the forms of it, how to really strategically utilize it, and there's always just going to be things you can continue to learn. If you're not familiar with what this term is, this is going to be something that is absolutely going to be a game changer for your progress in the gym and your progress with your physique. Because if you don't know what this is and you're not implementing it right now, it's probably a really big key missing piece. So we're going to go over what it is, why it's important. Sorry, I just hit the mic. That was probably a big boom. Why it's important. And in that note, kind of what types of exercise you may be doing now that might not even be conducive to progressive overload, and why we may need to look at changing that up completely, your form of exercise. We're going to look at types of progressive overload, so how to actually implement it into your workouts, how to really utilize it and which is maybe the best option, and then how to track your progress. So we're going to cover all those things, but let's start with what is progressive overload, this term that I keep saying. Well, let's break down the word, okay? Progression, right? It comes from the word progress. It means making progress over time, progressively adding, right? Oh, and well, that's what overload means, right? Like overloading it. So essentially what this term is continuing to add more to what you've been doing in order to insinuate's not the word I'm looking, in order to elicit progress. Elicit, that's the right word. So on a very bare bones level, what it means is adding intensity in some form, and we're going to get to the forms, week over week, day over day, or just, time over time, time in the gym over time in the gym, in order to tell the body that it needs to get better at something. Okay. So it essentially is adding like weight, intensity, more like it's trying, the purpose of it is to send a signal to the body that it needs to get better at something. Because if you think about it, if you just always do the same thing over and over, if you always bicep curl the same amount of weight, squat the same amount of weight, we can even apply it to other forms of exercise like running. If you only ever run the same distance at the same pace, like why would your body continue to do what it needs to do to get better? Because you're not asking any more of it, right? So like if you're only ever lifting the same amount of weight for this, same exercise for years and years on end, why is your body going to build more muscle? It can already do that, right? So it's not going to go through the effort of building more muscle or getting faster or whatever it needs to do if you're not telling it needs to do it. So hopefully that kind of explains in a nutshell like what progressive overload is. It's increasing the demand on the body in order to get the body to produce that output. And why it's important is because, I really just said it, like you're not going to continue to progress or see the physical change that you probably want in your body composition or see your performance change that you might want to in your strength. Or again, we can even apply this to other forms of exercise like distance running or speed. Like you're not going to see that progress if you don't send that signal. Okay. And as far as like types of exercises that don't necessarily utilize this. And I'm gonna probably bum some of you guys out here because I know a lot of this audience tends to get into fitness by utilizing group fitness, things like Orange Theory, Burn Boot Camp, HIIT classes, whatever. And I'm not saying those are bad things, but they're not really conducive to progressive overload because a lot of these types of workouts, Beachbody even, all of those, what they really promote is the fact that it's different every time. And they use this as kind of a selling point of like, you're never going to be bored. You get to confuse your muscles and that's a good thing. And like, in actuality, when we get down to the science of it, it's really not. Because again, there's no reason for your body to continue to adapt and get better at something if you're not continuously over and over telling it that it needs to get better, right? So some of these forms of exercises that don't have the same routine week over week and don't give you the opportunity to add more weight or add more load or add more whatever, it's not able to utilize progressive overload. Okay. And so it's so important to be able to use that. And like I've talked about kind of already how in strength training, there's some obvious ways, but even in running, like if you're training for a race, right, you're going to utilize, think about it, like you're going to utilize progressive overload. You're going to, like when people train for a marathon, they might start with a short run and then they work their way up to 4 miles and then they work their way up to 6 miles and then 8 miles. And that is progressive overload. You're forcing the demand on your body to get better until you can get to that 20, what's a marathon? 26.2 miles, right? So people do it. We see it obviously happen in running training. It's the same thing when it comes to strength training. We have to continue to increase that demand. So now the next important thing is, okay, you get why we need progressive overload. What are the forms of it? There's really, I think you can break it down into 4 major forms of progressive overload that you can play with in order to tell the body that it needs to adapt and continue to get stronger and build lean muscle. The first one is increase the weight that you are using. This is a really, really obvious one. And it's something that's linear to track, right? You either can lift more weight or you can't. You're lifting more weight week to week. You can write down what you were using and then use more next week. Like that's a very obvious way to know that you're getting stronger and making progress. And it's a tried and true one. Like I definitely would recommend using this one as often as you can. However, it is important to note that there is a limit to this, right? Like if we could always just continue to add weight on the bar, weight on the bar, weight on the bar, like we would all be squatting 1,000 pounds. And there is obviously a point of diminishing returns, a point of stalling, plateau, and a point of diminishing returns even too. If you continue to try to increase weight and you're not utilizing other variables like rest and recovery, like you can even see progress kind of go downhill. But increasing weight is definitely a great thing that to do the majority of the time. And it's really just that straightforward. Like week over week, you do the same movements. And if you used 50 pounds on your, shoulder press last week, okay, next week try to use 55. It's just that simple, right? So we'll leave it there. That's number 1, increase the weight that you're using. Number 2 is increase the volume. So volume is going to be the amounts of reps or sets that you're doing. You don't have to increase the reps and the sets. You can choose or pick or choose, right? Maybe you're doing 4 sets every week, but you're trying to go from 10 reps with the weight you used last week to 11 reps this week to 12 reps next week, right? Or maybe you're at a weight that you can really only get 10 reps with. You really can't push beyond that, but you could probably add another set, right? So instead of doing 4 sets, maybe you do 5, and you just add more volume there, right? And you can kind of see, I even just mentioned weight within this one. You'll see as I'm talking about these, that these can play into each other. There is no like only use one or like perfect way to do it. Like there could be kind of a combo of like, okay, well, I can't increase my weight anymore, so I'm going to do more reps, or I can increase my weight a little bit, but I can't do more reps if I increase the weight, so I'm going to do more sets. Like you can kind of combine these a little bit. But from a volume standpoint, if you think about it, if you're telling the body it needs to be able to do more of something, like even more quantity, even if you haven't increased the weight, it's still increasing the demand and your body's going to adapt. So again, pretty straightforward, pretty simple by doing more reps or more sets and or both, session over session as you follow the same workout plan. Number 3 is decrease rest periods. So it's probably pretty obvious if you think about it that if you are resting for less time in between your sets, you're going to get more tired and it's going to be harder, right? It's increasing the demand. Now, with this one, I'm going to put a little asterisk because the adaptation that you're kind of sending or like asking your body when you are doing less rest, it's not always going to be correlated perfectly to strength gains. I think it can a little bit, but I think A shorter rest period is really more so increasing a cardiovascular demand on the body and a ability for the body to regenerate ATP a little bit faster, regenerate like glycogen a little bit faster, which is really helpful to getting stronger in the long run. But it's not, I don't think, like a direct correlation to strength gains. Like if you are decreasing your rest to like 30 seconds and going set after set, that's going to feel a lot more like cardio. And it's adding a lot more of like a, yeah, cardiovascular demand on the body, which can be useful if that's something, if you're trying to increase endurance and your, cardiovascular health, but it just depends on what your goal is, right? So it's definitely something to use. And I think it's kind of two sides here. I think with people who are first getting into strength training, they're typically, not always, but a lot of times, coming from a background of HIIT classes, of very cardio heavy. Like, at least I see this with a lot of my women who come to us, is like they've come from a very cardio past. So they're very used to taking very short rest periods because they want their workouts to feel very hard, sweaty, like blah, 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 blah. And that's not always the best for building lean muscle. So oftentimes what we want to do is actually shift very opposite away from that and take much longer rest periods, really, really focus on strength. And so this isn't something I would necessarily utilize, like shortening rest periods again, isn't something I would utilize for clients like that, at least in their first bit of time. However, I do think on the opposite end of that spectrum, like within the bodybuilding world, within the strength world, we can get too comfortable with like our 2-minute, 3-minute rest periods. And we're not really ever focusing on like endurance and cardiovascular health. And this is like an underused one. So it really depends which end of the spectrum you end on or are on. And it's definitely something that can be utilized and I think make some great progress. So that's number 3, is just decreasing the amount of time you are resting in between your sets. And lastly, number 4, a very underrated one in my opinion, is playing with the intensity of your tempo. So let me explain what this means. If you've never really heard of tempo, and you're going to know what I'm talking about when I say it, you just haven't really maybe heard it called this, but tempo is the, how do I want to explain this? It's basically the counts or the amount of time that you are spending in each part of a exercise, a movement, a weightlifting movement. So if you are watching on YouTube right now, I will demonstrate and you're going to be able to see it. If you are not watching on YouTube and just listening to the podcast, I will do my best to describe this and I think it will make sense. But a bicep curl is probably the easiest one to explain this with. So you have 3 parts of a movement. You have the eccentric, the, I guess, isometric, and the concentric. So the eccentric is basically the time that you are like lowering the weights down. So if I'm doing a bicep curl, like let's say I'm starting with the dumbbells like at my shoulders, right? Like almost like I just finished a rep. And then I lower them down to my hips in order to begin to start the rep. That lowering down is what we would call the eccentric movement. And during that part of the movement, the muscle is lengthening. It's getting much longer. And I'll kind of get to like why it's important to train this part in a second, but I'll explain all the parts of the movement first. So that's what's happening. That's the eccentric part. Then you have the concentric part, which is the part most people think about and are like really typically focusing on in a lift. And that's going to be like in a bicep curl, of course, when we're bringing our hands from our hips back up to our shoulders and like lifting the weight up, right? That is the concentric. It's making our muscle shorten. Because if you think about it like our bicep, right? It inserts at our elbow and like somewhere in our shoulder. I'm not using the exact terminology, but just because for the basics. But like when you are moving those 2 points closer to each other, that muscle is getting shorter, right? And then like in that eccentric movement, when you're moving the dumbbell back to your hip, your elbow and your shoulder, the insertion points of the bicep, are getting further away from each other. So that muscle is getting longer, right? So concentric, it is getting shorter. And this is where like the power comes from. This is where like kind of the strength like is focused on, right? So that's the concentric part. And then you have the isometric, which is just that point where you're kind of holding it. So like if I were to squeeze the dumbbells right there after I'd finished the contact point, that would be the isometric hold. And that's like where the muscle's at its shortest point. So now that we understand the 3 parts of the movement, what tempo means is playing with the amount of time you spend in each movement. So a lot of people like just doing pretty quote unquote normal reps, they're going to typically spend like 1 count going up, right? It's just like a power count up. How fast can they move that weight? They typically don't spend much time sitting in that isometric hold. And then they typically lower that weight pretty fast, right? Like they just let gravity do that thing. And in the eccentric part, they usually only spend a 1 count, like going down. Now, if you can do a couple things here, like one big one is adding time on the isometric hold. Okay. So when you finish that rep, like of a bicep curl, when I have brought those dumbbells back up to my shoulders, squeezing your bicep and holding there for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, you can really make it what you want. and you're squeezing and tensing, that's going to make that movement a lot harder and in a different way, add demand on the body. And send a signal to the body that like it needs to get to do what it needs to do to be able to do that for longer and longer and longer. So that's option one, is playing with the isometric hold. Another great one is playing with the eccentric time, because so many people never focus on this portion of the movement. They always just like let gravity do its thing. Like think about like deadlifts, for example. Like people will pull the weight off the ground. They're like, oh, and they squeeze at the top and then they just throw the weight down. And they completely lose the opportunity to add a different type of demand on the body in that muscle lengthened position when the hamstrings are long, like in a bicep curl, when the biceps are long. Like that is a whole position of the muscle that needs to be trained. And so if you slowly lower the weight down, or like after you finish that deadlift, if you're slowly bringing the weight back down to the floor, you're going to feel that stretch in your hamstrings. Or again, in a bicep curl, you're going to feel that demand and stretch on the biceps as you lower that weight back down. That can be an incredibly great way to build muscle. So play with tempo. I think it's so underrated. This would definitely be my second favorite after increasing weight. It's very humbling. Definitely note that you're probably going to have to do less weight. This is also getting into kind of the next point here, how to utilize these forms. I think that the tempo is really one to use when you're struggling with, like, you've hit a point where maybe you can't add more weight. Adding more volume would like just be too much or make your workout way too long. Play with tempo, because you can make like the same weight that you've been doing forever and ever really hard if you play with tempo the right way. And so that kind of is like how to utilize them. Which one's the best one? Like, I think they're all have value. I mean, increased weight, again, is a really obvious linear one. I think tempo is the next most underrated one. But I would definitely make sure you're going through phases where you're focusing on each of them. Like, it's great to go through a 4 or 6 week split where your goal is to just add weight. And then maybe it's great to go through a 4 or 6 week split where you do the exact same workout you just did for 4 to 6 weeks, but you kind of stay at your same weights and make tempo really hard, right? So there's no perfect way, but play around with it. And then the last thing I will leave you on is, if you haven't been able to tell, obviously, like when it comes to progressive overload, the only way to do this is if you're doing the same workout for a period of time and you're increasing the weight or the volume or the whatever. So I should have made that clear from the beginning, but ideally you're following the same like split. So like if you're doing a 4-day split, it's the same 4 days for 4 weeks, 5 days for 4 weeks, whatever. For probably, I mean, I said 4 weeks, but probably like 4 to 8, honestly, even could go longer until you find yourself really hitting a plateau and not being able to progressively overload anymore. But you need to be doing the same movements so that you can increase the demand from week over week over week. Otherwise, it's just random. And like, why would the body build the muscle to get better at bicep curls if you're only doing bicep curls once every 10 weeks? You know what I mean? So it's really important to follow the same workout split. And then number two, it is really, really, really important to track your progress. I would really recommend having a training log, a notebook, an app, notes app on your phone, something to be able to write, okay, this week I did this many reps, this much weight, this rest period, so that you can go back next week and be like, oh, okay, last week I did that. Here's how I'm going to increase it. Because if you are just guessing, you are not progressing. If you're guessing, you're not progressing. That is absolutely a quote. Write it down. So like with our clients, we have a training app. It has their workout. They open it every day. It tells them, all the work, the exercises they're going to do, their rest periods. Then they can put in the weight that they use, and they can see over time, like how they progressed. And next week they can pull it up and see what they did and try to beat it. Right. And that is the most crucial thing to being successful with progressive overload. So I think that rounds out this Fast Fit Facts episode. I feel like I did a pretty good job at the time. I don't know what we're at right now, but hopefully it was efficient enough, and I hope you guys got something from it. So I will see you guys next week. Utilize this. Let's get strong, and I'll see you on the flip side. Bye.